In 1883, the United States government made it a criminal offense to be a healer. Not a criminal healer, not a dangerous healer. Any man or woman who used traditional medicine, roots, bark, ceremony, song, could be arrested, fined, imprisoned. And the reason they gave, the official reason, written down in federal records, was that this medicine was demoralizing and barbarous. This information has been sitting in government archives, in university libraries, in sealed ethnobotanical records for over 100 years. It was never secret because it was dangerous to enemies. It was hidden because it was valuable, and because the people who held it had no power to stop what was coming for them. 3 things happened at the same time in this country. The government made traditional native medicine illegal. Pharmaceutical companies began quietly studying it, and the people who held that knowledge found ways to protect it that no government could reach. We're going to follow all 3 threads. For at least 10,000 years, conservative estimate, possibly much longer, the people of this continent built a medical system. Not a folk tradition, a system. One with specialists, with accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of careful observation, with treatments that worked, not because of belief, but because the plants themselves contained the compounds that made them work. The Cherokee maintained detailed oral records of over 800 medicinal plant applications. The Ojibwe used compounds from black cohosh root to reduce inflammation, a mechanism that modern pharmacology now confirms works through the same pathway as aspirin. The Haudenosaunee, the people textbooks call the Iroquois, had a form of wound care that stopped French missionaries cold. When they reported it back to Paris in the 1600s, the accounts were dismissed as exaggeration. They weren't exaggerating. The Potawatomi knew which mosses acted as natural antiseptics. The Lakota used yarrow as a hemostatic, something to stop bleeding, centuries before Western medicine had a word for it. The Anishinaabe cultivated a relationship with wild ginger that modern researchers are only now beginning to study for its antifungal properties. This wasn't primitive trial and error. This was accumulated science, built over hundreds of generations, refined through direct observation, and encoded in language. And that's the mechanism by which they destroyed it. We'll come back to it. In 1883, the U.S. Department of the Interior formalized something that had been happening informally for decades. They called it the Code of Indian Offenses. On paper, it was framed as a civilizing measure, a way to help Native communities assimilate into American life. In practice, it was a demolition order. The code made it illegal to practice traditional medicine, to hold ceremonies, to consult with a medicine person. These were not suggestions. Violations carried real penalties, imprisonment, withholding of rations, forced labor. At the same time, a network of federal boarding schools was expanding across the country. Children, some as young as 4 years old, were removed from their families and sent to institutions hundreds of miles away. At these schools, speaking any Indigenous language was a punishable offense. If your medical knowledge lives in language, in words that have no direct English translation, in songs that encode dosage and preparation, in ceremonies that teach timing and context, and you make that language illegal, you haven't just silenced people, you've destroyed a library. Between 1883 and 1934, federal agents working under the Code of Indian Offenses confiscated and destroyed medicinal materials on reservations across the country. The records of these confiscations, the ones that survived, are held in the National Archives. Most people have never looked at them. Those records exist, and they read like a catalog of things someone didn't want you to know had ever existed. While that was happening on reservations, a different group of people was taking very detailed notes on native medicine, not to preserve it, to own it. The proof of what was lost is in what they replaced it with. Because the reason any of this mattered to anyone, government, pharmaceutical company, healer, or patient, is the same reason it matters right now. These plants work. In 1978, the National Cancer Institute released an internal report that most people have never heard of. It identified over 3,000 plant species with measurable anti-cancer properties. Of those, a significant majority came from indigenous habitats, and a portion of that knowledge trail led directly back to Native American medicinal practices. That same decade, ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultes, then at Harvard, published research confirming that indigenous plant knowledge represented one of the most concentrated bodies of pharmacological data ever assembled by any culture. His word: assembled. Not discovered, not stumbled upon, assembled. Over thousands of years. Echinacea. You've seen it at every drugstore. It's been used for immune support for decades in American consumer medicine. The Cheyenne and the Sioux were using it for infections and immune conditions for generations before a single Western doctor wrote down the word echinacea, witch hazel, wintergreen oil, wild ginger, golden seal, cascara bark, which formed the basis of early American laxative medicine. Every one of these was in Native American medical practice before European contact. Every one of them made money for someone who wasn't Native American. In 2012, a study in PLOS 1 found that roughly half of all top prescribed drugs in the United States trace their origins to plants. The knowledge of how those plants work, what dose, what preparation, what they interact with, came from somewhere. Much of it came from here. None of the communities who held it for 1,000 years received credit. Almost none received compensation. While the Code of Indian Offenses was still in effect, while medicine men were still being fined and imprisoned, pharmaceutical companies were quietly funding a new kind of scientist. They were called ethnobotanists, researchers who studied how specific cultures used plants, and some of them, not all but enough to matter, were going directly to native communities to collect that information. They would observe preparation methods, record names, ingredients, seasonal timing, application techniques, take physical samples. Then they would return to their laboratories, file patents, publish papers that did not mention where the knowledge came from. This practice now has a formal name in international law: biopiracy. The appropriation of biological knowledge from indigenous communities without consent or compensation. It wasn't called that in 1910. In 1910, it was just called business. Charles Eastman, a Santee Sioux physician who worked as a government Indian inspector in the early 1900s, wrote extensively about Native American medical knowledge in his published works. He documented what healers knew, what they used, what worked. He was trying to preserve it in the only form he thought might survive. The pharmaceutical researchers who read the same information were doing something different with it. By the time legislation began to address biopiracy in the 1990s, through the Convention on Biological Diversity, the extraction had been going on for nearly a century. The plants were valuable enough to build an industry on. They just weren't valuable enough to protect when they came with a language the government had already made illegal. After a century of burning, arresting, patenting, and extracting, what actually survived? More than they counted on. Memory is harder to burn than a plant bundle. Across reservations and urban native communities, there are still people who remember. People who were taught in back rooms and kitchens, who kept the knowledge alive by speaking it quietly, singing it, keeping it inside the family. The Navajo Nation today runs Dene College, which includes formal ethnobotany programs, preserving medicinal plant knowledge that was within a generation of being lost forever. The Cherokee Nation maintains a seed bank, not agricultural seeds, medicinal ones. Over 300 species of healing plants, documented and grown by tribal members trained by their grandparents. The Potawatomi, the Muskogee, the Anishinaabe. Across the country, tribal nations are rebuilding what was taken, slowly, deliberately, on their own terms. And now, again, pharmaceutical companies are paying attention. There are currently active research partnerships between universities and tribal nations to study traditional medicinal plants. Some of these are done with genuine respect and formal benefit-sharing agreements. Some are not. Right now, there are active international disputes over plant-based patents. Indigenous advocates argue the underlying knowledge was taken from communities that never consented to share it. The extraction did not stop in 1934. it changed shape. The 1978 American Indian Religious Freedom Act restored the legal right to practice traditional ceremonies, including medicine. It was a real change, but a law passed in 1978 cannot give back what was taken between 1883 and 1978. It cannot rebuild what was burned. It cannot unsilence the elders who died without passing on what they knew. What it can do is mark a starting point, and the communities who survived what was done to them, who protected this knowledge at personal cost, often against active enforcement, are the ones doing that rebuilding. The science is now confirming what these communities maintained for 1,000 years, that the plants work, that the knowledge was real, that what was called barbarous in 1883 was, and is, medicine. That knowledge is still here, not in a museum, not in a sealed government file. In the ground, in the hands of people who chose to remember. This is not ancient history. There are people alive right now whose grandparents were imprisoned for practicing this medicine. The knowledge that survived did so because people protected it when protecting it cost something. The knowledge that didn't survive, we don't know what we lost. We only know it's gone. The full source list is in the description. Every claim in this video is documented. Go look for yourself. The communities who protected this knowledge for a century, at real cost, never asked anyone to believe them on faith. They asked for honest attention. That's still the ask.